This week, we're borrowing a segment from our sister podcast, Coast to Canopy, where host Rob Diaz de Villegas leads a discussion about the Alum Bluff on the Apalachicola River. They also talk about steephead ravines, fossils, geology, and about the general and incredible biodiversity found in the Apalachicola Bluffs and ravines.
Alum Bluff towers over the Apalachicola River. The river has carved into it over geologic time, exposing millions of years of fossils. Each layer in the bluff tells stories of rising and falling seas, megalodon sharks hunting whales, or a shallow tropical ocean covering North Florida. Alum Bluff is also the western boundary of a biodiversity hotspot. Geology and biology converge in ecosystems unlike anything else in Florida, with plants and animals that are living fossils. Alum Bluff and the Apalachicola Bluffs and Ravines. These are the topics today on Coast to Canopy, an ecology podcast from WFSU Public Media. I'm your host, Rob Diaz de Villegas.
All right, joining me in the studio is Harley Means, Florida's state geologist and director of the Florida Geological Survey. Welcome, Harley.
Well, thank you, Rob. It's a pleasure to be here.
So let's start first with just how Alum Bluff looks. Now, I remember when I first saw it, I kayaked up to it. So there's a bend in the river, in the Apalachicola River, and it's about a mile stretch. And as you get closer and closer, you see something a lot larger than you see on a Florida river. So describe, what does Alum Bluff look like?
Yeah, so as you're approaching Alum Bluff, as you said, particularly if you're doing it from the river, the first thing that you see is this big giant bluff, thus the name. And it's quite unusual for our state because it's a significant bluff. It's over 100 feet tall. And so, us flatlanders here in Florida are not accustomed to seeing much in the way of topography. So that's really the first thing you notice is just, here's this giant bluff on, along the eastern side of the Apalachicola River, and it's quite prominent, and it was what first struck me the first time that I saw it.
And so what caused it to be so tall and be so rocky as well?
Yeah, so, that's a complicated question, but really what has happened is the migration of the Apalachicola River back and forth in its floodplain actually bumps up against the sidewall there, or what we call its the eastern side of its floodplain. And along that side of the floodplain, not much has been eroded. And in fact, once the river cuts into it, that's really the first it has eroded into these sediments that make up Alum Bluff. And there are, 4 nice geologic formations that are exposed there. And the lower ones are actually somewhat resistant to erosion because they're rocky, right? So limestone and some clay. And that sort of retards the erosive capabilities of the river. And so that's why you get those prominent bluffs along that part of the river in that region. On the other side of the river, we don't see that because the river has already meandered back and forth and eroded away those sediments that were deposited over there at one point.
Gotcha. And so there's 4 different layers that are present there. Let's start with the lower ones, and how old are they?
Yeah, so the oldest unit that you can see at Alum Bluff when the river stage is low enough is what's called the Chipola Formation, and it was deposited during what we call the Miocene epoch, and it's about 18 million years old. And what's really impressive about it are the abundance of marine fossils that you find there. And it's from those fossils that paleontologists are able to tell us something about the age of that unit.
Right above that is it undifferentiated Alum Bluff?
You got it. That's right. We call it undifferentiated as geologists because we haven't assigned it to a formation within the larger Alum Bluff group. So we just call it the Alum Bluff Group Undifferentiated Unit. And it's also a really interesting unit, but the fossils in it are quite a bit different. They're not marine, and in fact, they're terrestrial plant remains. And it's probably one of the most impressive assemblages of plant fossils in Florida. And plant fossils are pretty rare in our state. And you can find neat things like big palm fronds and nuts and seeds of plants that grew back probably some 15 million years ago. So again, it is another Miocene unit. It is younger than the one underneath it, and it's indicative of a time period when the climate was more temperate And we know this from the fossil flora that has been identified from that unit.
Gotcha. And so if someone is watching the video version of this podcast, we can see Harley taking out one of those palm frond fossils. That's kind of a neat thing to see. To think it's 15 million years old, yeah.
It is, and it's probably wasn't something you were expecting to see me, find at Alum Bluff. Those layers don't immediately look like they might harbor these kinds of fossils, and certainly one that is potentially as large as a big palm frond.
Right. We have a kind of marine environment in the Chipola Formation. Now we have a terrestrial environment. So what's the next layer?
Yeah. So sitting on top of that unit, there's quite a big gap in time, but the next unit up is called the Jackson Bluff Formation, and it is, again, a marine unit, and you can tell that as you walk along the bluff because you see, again, a huge assemblage of marine fossils that come out of that unit. Now, it's a little different in that it was deposited in a different kind of a marine environment than the Chipola Formation. And you can notice that not only from the fossils that are in it, but also the color and type of sediment that comprises that unit. So it's kind of dark and organic rich, and it is indicative of an estuary. So it's more of a nearshore marine environment than the underlying Chipola Formation was. And it was deposited about 3 to 3.5 million years ago during what we call the Pliocene epoch.
We visited Alum Bluff last October a couple different times, and one of those was a ceremony.
It is my honor to dedicate Alum Bluff as the 9th state geological site and the first state invertebrate paleontological site. I would like to present this plaque commemorating this designation to you. And I would like to say thank you so much.
Thank you.
And greatly appreciated. And thanks to all of you. So as the state geologist, one of the neat things that I get to do, one of the many neat things I get to do, is I get to designate places in the state that are significant geologically and or paleontologically. And it turns out Alum Bluff is one of those unique places where both things are true. And so Alum Bluff was just a natural place for me to designate not only a state geological site, but also the first state invertebrate paleontological site. Now, there are others around the state that I may designate at some point in the future, but Alum Bluff is so well known in the geological literature and known to geologists in the southeastern U.S. that it really warranted the first designation with this.
Talk about the numbers of different marine species found in the Chipola Formation.
Yeah, so the Chipola Formation is really quite incredible, and it occurs, not only here at Alum Bluff, where we're talking about, but also further to the west. You can find exposures of it along the Chipola River, which is where it was named from. And paleontologists estimate that it has in excess of probably about 1,100 species of marine mollusks that have been identified in it. And that's a huge diversity of molluscan taxa. And what it's indicative of is a time when it was more tropical in North Florida. In fact, that was really probably the last time North Florida really saw a tropical climate. And that's reflected in all those amazing marine fossils we see, and we see fossil corals and fossil echinoids, and so the whole diversity of things that lived in the marine environment at that time.
So, talk about going to Alum Bluff to look for fossils. Now, with this designation, does this receive extra protection than it didn't before, as far as it being a fossil site?
So, Rob, statutorily it does. And since its designation in statute, it does say that if people go there to collect, they are required to actually have the written permission of the state geologist. Now, what I would say is, that's probably not reasonable. And since the bluff is an erosional feature and it's constantly cutting in and it is eroding out fossils, and those fossils, eventually get deposited in the river and broken up and transported, if you go to Alum Bluff, we would just ask that, be respectful. Don't dig into the bluff and cause, huge blocks to tumble down and be eroded. And, if you want to pick up a fossil or two that have already eroded out, that's probably okay. But it is recognized now as a state invertebrate paleontological site, so it is afforded a little more protection.
Gotcha. So over the years, we've talked about, I've done a previous video segment with you on Alum Bluff, and you brought in shark teeth. And even when the second time we visited in November last year, we found a very small little shark tooth. So talk about those. Those aren't from the Chipola Formation, right? Those are from a little later. But yeah, talk about the shark teeth there.
Yeah. Well, so, most Floridians certainly appreciate and understand, sharks live in the modern marine environment, and we're usually awed by them as, fierce predators and unique animals that live in our marine environment. And, kids are always enamored by sharks, but particularly if you find a shark tooth. And in this case, at Alum Bluff, you can find shark teeth, but you can even find the shark teeth of what was once the largest marine predator to have ever lived. So megalodon, and they're not common, but occasionally you can find a megalodon tooth there. But what kid is not super excited or amazed when they look down and see that little triangular shark tooth fossil? I certainly was, as a kid. So.
Yeah. Talk about the size of that tooth. I mean, the tooth that we found, there maybe it's like a little less than an inch, a couple centimeters. I don't know. Yeah. How big is a megalodon tooth?
Well, megalodon teeth can reach more than 6 inches in length.
Yeah.
And that's a really, really large example. Now, they don't all get that large. Most of them are smaller than that.
Yeah.
The largest one I have seen from Alum Bluff is probably no more than about 5 to 5.5 inches in length. But the size of the teeth is probably more reflective of the species of shark. And there are multiple species of sharks where the teeth have been found in the deposits at Alum Bluff. Primarily, they come out of the Jackson Bluff Formation. It's not unheard of to find one in the underlying Chipola Formation, but they're certainly not as common.
Right.
So the Jackson Bluff Formation is the one that currently is known to have more species of fossil shark teeth come from it.
Gotcha. And then I guess I remember talking at one point with you, maybe there are whale bones in there, maybe with evidence that they've been attacked?
Yeah, absolutely. You do find vertebrate remains there, and most of the vertebrates that you find are the vertebrate remains of marine mammals, which makes sense because it's a marine deposit. And many of those bones are broken up and tumbled, but many of them could show evidence of what might have happened to them, and why those bones might be there. And that evidence comes in the form of cut marks and other marks that are left as a signature of maybe a marine predator that might have attacked this marine mammal while it was alive, or it could have been a scavenger that chomped on the animal after it perished. But yeah, occasionally you do find ribs and vertebra and other parts of these marine mammals that have those signature marks on them. Paleontologists can take a look at those and use that as evidence for what may have been happening at that time with that particular animal.
Later in the conversation, we were joined by Harley's father.
All right, now we welcome Bruce Means to Coast to Canopy. Bruce is the former director of Tall Timbers Research Station and the founder of the Coastal Plains Institute, among many other titles I could probably dig up if I had to. Welcome to Coast to Canopy, Bruce.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
So I'm going to go back to Alum Bluff and our outing last November. We went up to a little waterfall coming out of the side of Alum Bluff, and we climbed up and we went back and saw a little stream. So talk about what we were seeing there on Alum Bluff. Either one of you, I guess, could chime in.
Well, I might chime in just from the geological and hydrological perspective. So when we were standing there looking at that, Rob, I'm sure I mentioned the term steephead, which we just said. So steepheads are unique geomorphic features that form in areas where you've got a deep sandy deposit like the Citronelle Formation, which is an unconsolidated quartz sand, and that sits on top of the Jackson Bluff Formation. And the Jackson Bluff Formation is clay and clayey sand, so it's fairly impermeable to the downward percolation of groundwater. So we all know Florida gets quite a bit of rainfall, and when that rain hits the land surface, part of what hits the land surface can percolate down and get into the underlying sediments. and that's what we call our aquifers, right? And that's where we get our recharge. But at Alum Bluff and in areas adjacent to Alum Bluff in this area, where that Jackson Bluff formation occurs, that groundwater can no longer percolate downward, and it has to migrate laterally. And as it migrates laterally, it eventually will bleed off into the Apalachicola River Valley, right? And when it does that, you start to get headward erosion. So what we were seeing there was one of these steep head ravines. We didn't walk all the way up to the head, which is what we would call the steep head. But what you do is you would walk along and probably right on top of the Jackson Bluff formation there until you get up to its head. So that's the mechanism for the formation of these things.
So the geologists discovered steep heads and identified their unique geomorphology and how the bleeding or the sapping, they called it, of the groundwater created a steep head. Well, then as a biologist, I think I'm the first biologist to recognize how cool they were. And I published several papers in semi-technical and semi-popular literature early on to try to bring the focus onto steep heads and how neat they were. And it turns out I have looked all over the world and read literature all over the world. There's almost no steep heads anywhere else but in Panhandle, Florida, except over at Palatka Ravine Garden State Park and Goldhead Branch. There's a couple of steep heads on that side of the peninsula, upper peninsula of Florida. But elsewhere in the world, they don't seem to be found anywhere else but just in our panhandle.
Wow.
And they're like 150 or 200 or more. And if I live long enough, and Harley puts up with me long enough, he and I would like to finish a paper we've thought about starting on the biology of Florida steepheads. But somebody else has discovered how interesting they are. Do you know that Florida's steepheads have been used as a model to adduce the presence of water on Mars? And when you look from a satellite at the Florida steepheads, the way the steepheads migrate, they have a special signature.
The Christmas tree, sort of
like,
kind of
yeah,
the branches and branches.
But you can see that you can see the heads. You can understand. Whoa, that's not a classic gully eroded sort of a situation. And one of the papers about Mars actually has a picture of Florida steepheads from an aerial or a satellite image next to a satellite image or a spaceship image they took of Mars showing the same phenomenon.
I'll have to find that.
So, well, I'll send it to you.
Okay, yeah. So geologically, they're unique. But as a biologist, you started noticing some things about them. So talk about what do we find in these that makes them sort of biologically unique as well?
Well, they're biologically fascinating because the water that leaks into and runs their aquatic environment is almost completely perennial, meaning it never dries up. And the reason for that is there's this huge perched aquifer that is bleeding into these steep heads. You can imagine the aquifer during our 50 or 60 inches of annual rainfall, that water, a lot of it percolates down and builds up this underground lake that is bleeding into the steep heads. Well, it takes a long time for that lake to get, exhausted. Meanwhile, it's being restored by more rainfall, except then right now we're in this big drought.
Yeah.
And I don't know what's going on now. But anyway, so that means that the animals and plants that live in a steep head environment are always experiencing the moisture in the soils and the creek. And so there are some fishes that go up those steep heads, some quite interesting ones. But there is a fire-backed crayfish that's only known from the Apalachicola ravines. Now that includes the steep heads as well as the gully-eroded ravines.
Right.
And then that salamander I was so keen on studying, I discerned years ago it was a unique species only known from the Apalachicola River system, but it's found both in the steep heads as well as in the gully-eroded ravines. But it's a unique species in that stream system.
Yeah.
But then we got the plants. Plants require moisture too. So in a steep head, especially those that are aligned east and west, On the north side of their slopes, the sun coming in from the south dries the slope out more than on the south side. The south side's in a sun shadow. So it turns out Torreya, the rare yew, and Taxus, another rare yew, both of them
Yew
seem
trees.
to be, yew trees. They're endemic species just found in the Apalachicola Ravines, both the steepheads as well as the gully-eroded ravines, and not found anywhere else on Earth. And there's even an herbaceous plant called Chromia that's really ancient, and its closest relative is over in Asia, like the yew trees.
Yeah.
But anyway, so what I'm saying is the gully-eroded ravines will dry out, especially in a time like this, and animals and plants that require that nice moisture will be under big stress during drought times. But in steepheads, they're not.
Right, and that water is always running. It's kind of surprisingly fast, I think. I mean,
Oh, yeah.
it's a good flowing.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, it comes out. I have in my 60 years. 60 years or more of going into several of those steepheads. I actually have photographs of an area almost the size of this room, which is like, say, 15 feet by 10 feet or more, that is slumped down and is being carried away, showing that the head is migrating. I mean, I actually can give you some statistics on how rapidly that one steephead is migrating headward. That's a diversion, but
it's interesting. How old are steephead ravines, do we think? I mean, when did a lot of these start?
well, Harley will have to tell you, they couldn't have started before the formation, right?
No, correct. So the deposition of the citronelle formation, which is required for the formation, at least in this area of steepheads, it was deposited probably about 2.5 to 3 million years ago. Now, that's not to say that that's exactly when the steepheads started forming, but they certainly couldn't have started forming any earlier than that. However, I will caveat that by saying that there were probably other sand deposits that were deposited earlier that have long since eroded away that may have harbored steephead ravines, but those are long since gone. So now we have the modern ones today that are developing in the citronelle, at least in the Apalachicola Bluffs and Ravines area.
Right.
Well, one of the great things about those steepheads, that water is so clean. It's highly potable because it's coming out of that huge sand body. And the only thing that would contaminate it is anything people would dump on the ground surface that would percolate down and get into the underground aquifer that feeds all that. So let's hope. Well, years ago, Florida Natural Areas Inventory people and myself and others got really upset because there was a move afoot by a electric generating company to buy some of those steepheads and dam them up. And we had to fight that. And
Interesting.
Fortunately, a good many of the steepheads along the Apalachicola Bluffs and Ravines area are now in Torreya State Park or the Nature Conservancy's Apalachicola Bluffs and Ravines property. Those on Eglin Air Force Base, which are even more spectacular, many of them, are subject to the vicissitudes of the politics that govern Air Force and other military installations, and you never know what's going to happen when we get into situations where people who are running those facilities are new people, they came from somewhere else, they don't know what a steephead is, or they don't care. So we're always on the lookout for stopping, or trying to preserve and save our natural heritage.
So, Rob, let me throw something else out that I think is important that we haven't spoken about yet. And it's the not only the consistency, the amount of water that comes out of them, but it's also the constant temperature. Just like Florida's artesian spring water, right, that is a constant temperature either from 68 to about 72 degrees, depending on where you are in the state. So too goes for the water that is flowing in these steepheads. Since it's aquifer water, it's generally about the average annual air temperature in the areas where these steepheads occur.
Harley's absolutely right. And what I would like to see happen is in the future, these ravines all of our area needs to be studied more by biologists. I would guess that because of what he's talking about, the buffering effect of thermal and moisture regimes in steepheads, that there are invertebrate animals like mayflies or tiny little crustaceans called amphipods and isopods that might actually be endemic and found in these ravines. We just haven't found anyone studying them yet.
Interesting. There's a groundwater lab at FAMU. I've done a couple stories, and he usually goes into spring caves to do that. That'd be an interesting thing to bring up. I mean, to check that out. Yeah,
for sure.
So through DNA, he's finding all kinds of interesting things about their distribution.
Yeah.
Maybe he'll hear this podcast.
Yeah, or maybe I ought to send it to him. So I want to go back to salamanders. So we talked about the Apalachicola dusky salamander, which is what brought you in there. You were looking to differentiate it from another salamander that's found not too far away. Talk a little bit about that story and how you came to find out that this is a whole separate animal.
Right. I determined that there was a population of salamanders in the Apalachicola Bluffs and Ravines that was at the headwaters, up at these steep heads itself. And every steep head had that population, and I could characterize its morphology. And as you go downstream, the streams, of course, get bigger and bigger, and eventually they get so big during rainy periods that they overtop their banks, and they create a little floodplain. And when the water goes back down, that floodplain is wet and has swampy, mucky places in it. And that's where I found another salamander that was being confused with the Apalachicola dusky. And then eventually I named the Apalachicola dusky, and it is held up to DNA scrutiny. It's only found in our Apalachicola ravines, actually also in the Ochlockonee.
You can hear the rest of this conversation on the Coast to Canopy podcast. I highly recommend the video version and the accompanying blog post, which you can find at wfsu.org/ecologyblog or the WFSU Ecology YouTube channel.